The chamber of the Galactic Empire's high command gleamed with polished obsidian, a testament to their technological supremacy. Holograms of star systems rotated lazily above the central table, where officers with elongated heads and glimmering scales debated strategy. General Terras, a towering figure with shimmering violet skin, sneered as he waved his clawed hand dismissively at an image of Earth. "These humans," Terras scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain, "cling to their antiquated relics as if they hold meaning. Take this Howitzer, for example." The hologram shifted, showing a crude, barrel-shaped weapon on wheels. Laughter rippled through the room. "Their ingenuity peaked centuries ago," added strategist Valus, his golden eyes narrowing. "They rely on brute force, not innovation. It's no wonder their planet folded so easily into our dominion." A younger officer chimed in, eager to impress. "General, I heard they once believed this. Howitzer could win wars. As if hurling lumps of metal could match the precision of our quantum disruptor arrays." Another round of laughter filled the chamber. Terras silenced them with a raised hand. "Yet they persist in defiance, despite their inferiority. This new rebellion festering in the outer colonies? It reeks of desperation." He gestured toward a new hologram, this one displaying scattered outposts on desolate moons. "We shall crush them swiftly and remind the galaxy of humanity's irrelevance." Valus leaned forward, his voice silky. "Perhaps we should allow them to resist a little longer. Their primitive tactics amuse our troops. It builds morale when they destroy these artifacts." The room murmured in agreement, and the hologram zoomed in on one of the colonies. A faint blue glow highlighted the harsh terrain. The Empire's sensors had detected small concentrations of human activity, a clear sign of rebel presence. "They're hoarding old Earth weaponry," Terras continued, a smirk tugging at his sharp features. "Scrap metal and outdated ballistics. Hardly worth deploying our full forces. A single strike fleet should suffice to obliterate their hopes." Meanwhile, in the shadows of a cold and barren moon, the human rebels worked tirelessly in silence. Their base was a labyrinth of salvaged starship parts and makeshift bunkers, blending into the rocky terrain. Captain Ada Novak, a woman with piercing gray eyes and a weathered face, surveyed the scene with a calculating gaze. Around her, engineers and soldiers moved with quiet determination, assembling weapons and fortifying their defenses. "We can't keep running forever," she said to Lieutenant Marcus Kane, her second-in-command. He was younger, with an air of optimism that contrasted with Ada's hardened demeanor. "The Empire doesn't leave survivors." Kane adjusted his rifle, his voice steady. "Then we make our stand here. But what do we have that can stand up to their fleet? Blasters and salvaged drones aren't going to cut it." Ada's attention shifted as Engineer Li Wei approached, dragging a tarp-covered object behind him. His face was streaked with grease, and his eyes burned with intensity. "Captain," he began, pulling the tarp away to reveal the hulking silhouette of a cannon. "This might be the answer." Kane frowned, crossing his arms. "That's a relic. An old howitzer. What good is that against energy shields?" Li Wei grinned, his excitement undeterred. "More than you think. This thing isn't just a relic, it's raw power. The Empire's tech relies on anticipating energy signatures and advanced targeting systems. This? It's analog. Pure physics. It fires massive shells at insane speeds. They won't see it coming." Ada crouched, running her hand over the weapon's cold metal. It was ancient, pitted with rust in places, but its barrel still carried an air of menace. "How'd you get this operational?" "Modified the targeting system," Li Wei said proudly. "We can use modern data inputs to guide the trajectory, but the core mechanics remain the same. It's not about how advanced it is. It's about how precise we can make it." Kane remained skeptical, shaking his head. "Even if it works, one shot won't change anything." "It might," Ada countered, standing. Her voice carried a conviction that silenced the room. If we aim for their command ships, take out their fleet's brain, and the rest crumbles. The tension in the air was palpable. Ada turned to Li Wei. Get it ready. We don't have much time. Then, to Kane, rally the troops. If we're going down, we're taking some of them with us. As the rebels prepared, whispers spread through the camp about the ancient weapon. Some dismissed it as futile. Others, inspired by Ada's determination, began to believe. In the corner of the room, an older soldier muttered under his breath, "It's not about how advanced, it's about how precise." The words echoed through the outpost, becoming a mantra for their stand. Back in the Empire's command ship, Terras watched as the fleet began to mobilize, shimmering starships cutting through the void like predators closing in on their prey. These humans will learn their place, he declared. By tomorrow, their rebellion will be nothing but dust. But in the shadows of the moon, the Howitzer stood ready, a silent testament to humanity's defiance. The rebel outpost clung to the barren moon's jagged surface, its ramshackle structures blending with the gray rock. Metal sheets, salvaged starship panels, and scraps of outdated tech formed walls and roofs, barely held together by welding seams. Below ground, the base extended into narrow tunnels illuminated by dim, flickering lights. The air was heavy with the tang of burnt circuits and oil, underscoring the rebels' reliance on whatever they could scavenge. In a makeshift command center, Captain Ada Novak stood over a rusted table. A map of the surrounding terrain was projected onto its scratched surface, revealing defensive perimeters and entry points. Her sharp, gray eyes darted across the display, searching for vulnerabilities. Despite her slender frame, there was an unyielding strength in her posture, honed by years of struggle. "We need more time," she said, her voice even but strained. Lieutenant Marcus Kane, leaning against a console nearby, pushed a lock of brown hair from his forehead. His hands moved deftly over a keyboard, pulling up data from nearby sensors. "Time's the one thing we don't have, Captain. Their fleet's already moving. We're talking hours, maybe less." His optimism, a trait that rarely faltered, was noticeably absent. Ada straightened and folded her arms. "Then we make every second count. Prioritize choke points and fallback positions. If they land troops, we bleed them for every step they take." Marcus nodded, though his lips pressed into a thin line. "Understood. But unless we've got something big up our sleeves, this is going to be a slaughter." Before Ada could respond, the sound of heavy boots on metal echoed through the room. Engineer Li Wei entered, his coveralls streaked with grease and his face lit with barely contained excitement. Behind him, a group of soldiers strained to drag a tarp-covered object into the room. "I've got something," Li Wei said, pulling the tarp aside with a flourish. Beneath it was an old earth howitzer, its steel frame worn but intact. The room fell silent as everyone stared at the relic. Ada's brow furrowed. "Is this a joke, Li?" Marcus let out a low whistle, tilting his head. "I'll give it to you, Wei. That's one hell of a history lesson. But what are we supposed to do with it? Throw it at the Empire?" Li's grin widened as he ignored the skepticism. He patted the howitzer's barrel like a proud parent. "This beauty. She's not just some relic. She's a game changer. The Empire's advanced tech relies on energy signatures and predictable weaponry. This thing. It's pure physics. No energy to trace, no emissions to detect. A hunk of iron traveling at Mach speeds doesn't need to be pretty to hurt." Ada circled the weapon, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The howitzer had seen better days, its paint long faded and its wheels scuffed. "And you're telling me this thing still works?" "Better than you'd think," Li replied, crouching beside it. "I've upgraded the targeting system. Linked it with modern sensors for precise adjustments. Sure, the guts are old school, but the aim. Top-notch. We can punch through armor, maybe even shields if we hit the right frequency gaps." Marcus raised an eyebrow. Let's say it works. One shot won't stop a fleet. They'll rain fire down before we can reload. True, Lee admitted, but if we hit something critical, like their command ship, it could scatter their forces. Even a moment of chaos might buy us enough time. Ada paced, her mind racing. The idea was ludicrous, bordering on desperate, yet there was logic beneath the madness. It's a gamble, she said finally. But at this point, we don't have a choice. Marcus sighed, shaking his head but not arguing. I'll help get it set up. If this thing's going to save us, it better be ready when the Empire shows up. Lee beamed, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. You won't regret it. As they moved the howitzer to the surface, the mood in the outpost shifted. Word spread about the ancient weapon, sparking hushed debates. Some dismissed it as a desperate stunt, while others clung to the hope it represented. Ada gathered her key personnel in the briefing room, the howitzer now assembled and operational on a ridge overlooking the base. The Empire's fleet will be here soon, she began, her voice calm but firm. When they arrive, they'll bring everything they have to crush us. Our defenses won't hold forever, but if we're smart, we can make them bleed for every inch. She gestured to the holographic map. The howitzer is our ace. It's old, yes, but it can do something their sensors won't expect. Our target is their command ship. If we can cripple it, we cut off their chain of command. Marcus leaned against the wall, arms crossed. What's the plan if they land troops before we fire? Ada didn't hesitate. We hold the line. We buy time for Lee and his team to line up the shot. No matter the cost. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Finally, Lee spoke, his voice steady. It'll work, Captain. You'll see. As the team dispersed to prepare, Ada lingered near the howitzer. The stars above seemed impossibly distant, and for a moment, doubt crept into her mind. Then she placed a hand on the weapon's barrel, its cold surface grounding her. We've made it this far, she murmured. Let's show them what humanity can do. The Empire's Armada surged through the void, a breathtaking display of technological supremacy. Massive warships, each the size of a sprawling city, glided in perfect formation, their polished hulls gleaming under the light of distant stars. Smaller frigates darted between them like predators guarding their larger kin. The fleet's energy shields shimmered faintly, an imperceptible barrier to most eyes but a wall of invincibility to anyone foolish enough to resist. On the bridge of the Dominance, the Empire's flagship, General Terras stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the holographic projections of the rebel moon. A faint smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. This is what they've chosen to defend, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. A barren rock littered with the refuse of their failed history. It's almost insulting to mobilize an armada for such a trivial task. Strategist Valus hovered nearby, his golden eyes scanning rows of data projected into the air. Consider it an opportunity to remind the galaxy of our reach. Crushing these remnants will make an example of them. Let them see how little effort it takes for us to annihilate an entire rebellion. A junior officer spoke up, his tone eager. Our disruptor cannons will vaporize their hideouts within moments of orbital bombardment. And their relics? Laughable. Their primitive artillery poses no threat to us. Terras nodded. Deploy minimal ground forces. There's no need to waste resources on a spectacle. Let our ships handle this from above. We will rain precision strikes on their defenses until they have no choice but to surrender, or die. Meanwhile, the rebel moon came alive with quiet determination. Beneath the cold surface, Ada's team worked tirelessly to prepare their defenses. Engineers hauled ammunition for the howitzer, while soldiers reinforced barricades and mapped fallback routes. In a secluded corner of the outpost, the howitzer loomed like a sentinel, its retrofitted targeting system glowing faintly with the pulse of integrated modern tech. Li Wei crouched near the howitzer, adjusting cables and fine-tuning the alignment of its improvised sensors. "This better work," he muttered, sweat dripping from his brow. Marcus Kane leaned against a nearby crate, watching him work. "If it doesn't, we're all dead." "No pressure." Ada approached, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Report." Li straightened, wiping his hands on his coveralls. "Targeting systems calibrated. The sensors will adapt to their shield frequencies, but only if we can get a clear shot at their flagship. Timing will be everything." Marcus frowned. "And if we miss?" "We don't miss," Ada said, her voice firm. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing on them all. Li broke it with a nervous laugh. "Well, if this thing doesn't work, I hope they at least admire our creativity before they blow us to bits." Marcus shot him a look. "Not helping." Ada stepped closer to the howitzer, running her hand along its barrel. The metal was cool, its surface worn but sturdy. It felt like a relic of another era, but in that moment, it was their only hope. "This isn't just about the weapon," she said, her voice steady. "It's about showing them that we're not done fighting. That we're not as easy to crush as they think." Li hesitated, then nodded. "I get it, Captain. But, you ever wonder if it's worth it? Fighting with scraps, losing people just to make a point." Ada's gaze didn't waver. "It's worth it if we remind them that we're human. That we don't give up, no matter the odds. It's not the weapon, it's the will to use it." Her words hung in the air, unspoken doubts surfacing briefly before being pushed aside. Above the moon, the Empire's fleet slowed, positioning itself for an attack. On the Dominance, Terras watched as targeting arrays locked onto the rebel outpost. "Begin bombardment," he ordered, his voice calm, almost bored. "Let's end this quickly." Energy cannons on the fleet's front lines began to glow, their power building for a devastating volley. On the surface, the rebels braced for impact, their defenses shaking as the first blasts tore through the moon's crust. Ada's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold your positions. Li, is it ready?" Li scrambled to finalize the howitzer's alignment. "Almost there. Just need a few more seconds." "Marcus, get me a visual on their flagship," Ada barked. Marcus typed furiously, pulling up a grainy image on a nearby monitor. The Dominance loomed larger than anything Ada had ever seen, its shield shimmering faintly in the darkness. Li gave a thumbs up. "We're good to go." Ada's jaw tightened. "Then let's show them what a relic can do." The initial wave of the Empire's assault was relentless. Orbital bombardments lit up the barren moon, sending shockwaves through the rebel outpost. Chunks of rock and metal rained down as the surface was torn apart by precision energy strikes. Inside the outpost, walls buckled and groaned, but the rebels held their positions, their faces grim with determination. Ada barked orders through the chaos, her voice cutting through the rumble of destruction. "Move. Keep them guessing. No concentrated targets." Rebel squads emerged from hidden tunnels and bunkers, striking at the Empire's ground troops with hit-and-run tactics. Makeshift rocket launchers and scavenged blasters were their only weapons against heavily armed and armored foes, but they used the terrain to their advantage. Soldiers darted between craters and jagged ridges, luring Imperial squads into deadly ambushes. Above, the Dominance hung like an unassailable fortress, its cannons methodically reducing the surface to rubble. On the bridge, General Terras watched the destruction with detached satisfaction. "Resistance is minimal," an officer reported. "Ground forces are meeting light opposition. Orbital scans detect no significant defenses." Terras smirked. "Finish the sweep. These insects are wasting our time." Meanwhile, on the surface, Li Wei and his team worked frantically to finalize the howitzer's targeting system. The weapon was positioned on a rocky ridge, concealed beneath camouflage netting. Li's hands trembled as he tightened the cable, the pressure of the moment weighing heavily on him. It's now or never. Marcus shouted, running up with data from the sensor team. The flagship is holding steady in orbit. If we're going to do this, we need to do it now. Ada joined them, wiping dust from her face. Lee, is it ready? Lee nodded, though his voice betrayed his nerves. As ready as it'll ever be. The targeting systems locked onto a gap in their shields, but we only get one clean shot. Ada took a deep breath. Then make it count. The howitzer roared to life, its ancient mechanisms grinding and clanking as the barrel adjusted its aim. The rebels held their breath as Lee input the final calculations. A deafening boom followed as the shell launched, its trajectory a blazing arc through the thin atmosphere. In orbit, the Empire's fleet continued its bombardment, oblivious to the incoming threat. The shell struck the Dominance with surgical precision, piercing its shimmering shields and embedding itself deep within the ship's core. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, an explosion ripped through the flagship, sending shockwaves that shook the surrounding fleet. On the bridge, alarms blared as sparks rained from control panels. Terra staggered, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. What just happened? Unclear, an officer stammered. Some kind of projectile, primitive, but devastating. Terra snarled. A lucky shot. Find and eliminate the source. Back on the moon, cheers erupted among the rebels, but Ada silenced them with a sharp gesture. We're not done yet. Reload and prepare for another strike. Lee and his team scrambled to reload the howitzer, their movements fueled by adrenaline. Above, the Empire's fleet began to regroup, but the damage was done. The destruction of their flagship had thrown their ranks into chaos, and the rebels seized the opportunity. The howitzer fired again, this time targeting a smaller cruiser. The shell tore through its engines, leaving it dead in space. As the crippled ship drifted, other rebel squads launched coordinated strikes on ground forces, cutting off their reinforcements. On the Dominance, now operating on emergency power, Terras clenched his fists. How are they doing this? They're using scrap. Destroy that weapon before they tear us apart. Ada, watching the Empire's response, knew their window of opportunity was closing. Lee, how many more shots can we get? 2, maybe 3, Lee replied, his voice strained. After that, the barrel's done for. Then we focus everything on their fleet's core. If we can break their command, the rest might fall back. The next shot from the howitzer struck another capital ship, its shields flickering before collapsing entirely. The rebels' precision and the howitzer's raw power had turned the tide, forcing the Empire into a defensive posture. But the victory came at a cost. The outpost was in ruins, and rebel casualties mounted with each passing minute. Ada surveyed the wreckage, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken. We've got one more shot, Lee announced, his voice cracking from exhaustion. But after that, we're sitting ducks. Ada placed a hand on his shoulder. Then we make it count. Marcus, give me a clear line on their command ship. If we're going out, we're taking them with us. The final shell was loaded, the howitzer groaning under the strain of its archaic mechanisms. Ada stood by Lee and Marcus, her eyes locked on the targeting display. The Empire's flagship loomed in the crosshairs, its shields fluctuating as it absorbed fire from the battle below. Fire, she said, her voice steady. The howitzer unleashed its final shot, the recoil nearly toppling the battered weapon. The shell streaked through space, cutting a path toward its target. The rebels watched in silence, every heartbeat stretching into eternity. The impact was cataclysmic. The command ship erupted in a brilliant flash, its fragments scattering like dying stars. The Empire's fleet faltered, its remaining ships retreating in disarray. As the dust settled, Ada looked around at what remained of her forces. Their victory had come at a steep price, but they had proven something that could never be erased: humanity's spirit was not so easily crushed. The battlefield was quiet now, save for the faint hum of retreating Empire vessels. Their once mighty fleet scattered like ash in the wind, leaving behind the smoldering remains of their flagship and several crippled cruisers. The rebels watched in silence as the last ship blinked out of sight, disbelief etched on their faces. Against all odds, they had won. In the Empire's War Council chambers, the mood was anything but quiet. Alien commanders argued in heated tones, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of blame and disbelief. "This is unacceptable," roared one, slamming a clawed hand onto the table. "An ancient human weapon pierced our shields. It's impossible." General Terras, still reeling from the humiliation, stood with a dark expression. "It happened," he growled. "Dismiss it as a fluke if you wish, but the fact remains, they exploited a vulnerability we didn't account for." Strategist Valus interjected, his tone cold and calculating. "A vulnerability in our thinking. We saw them as primitives, relics of a bygone era. That arrogance cost us." A junior officer hesitated before speaking. "Shall we mobilize for retaliation, General? Crush them before word spreads?" Terras hesitated, his claws tapping rhythmically on the table. "No. Not yet. This incident has drawn attention we don't need. Let the propagandists spin it. We'll say it was a minor uprising, an internal matter." "And if others are inspired?" Valus asked pointedly. Terras' eyes narrowed. "Then we'll be ready. Next time, we won't underestimate them." Back on the rebel moon, cheers erupted from those who had survived. Soldiers embraced, their voices filled with relief and triumph. The Howitzer, battered but standing, became a symbol of their defiance. Yet amidst the celebration, a heavy silence hung in the background, the weight of those who hadn't lived to see the victory. Ada stood apart from the crowd, her eyes scanning the battlefield. The outpost was in ruins, craters and debris marking where friends had fallen. She spotted Marcus sitting by a pile of makeshift graves, his usually bright expression subdued. "Hell of a fight," he said as she approached, his voice low. Ada nodded. "Hell of a price." Lee joined them, his face streaked with soot. "We did it, though. That's gotta count for something, right?" "It counts," Ada said. "But it's not just about winning one battle. It's about what happens next." She glanced at the howitzer, its barrel blackened but still intact. "That thing shouldn't have worked. By every measure of logic, we should have been wiped out." Lee grinned faintly. "Guess logic doesn't account for stubbornness. Or desperation," Marcus added. As night fell, the rebels gathered to honor their dead. Candles flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows over the battered outpost. Ada spoke briefly, her words steady despite the ache in her chest. "They said we were relics. That we couldn't stand against their might. But tonight, we proved that even the smallest spark can light a fire." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This isn't the end. It's the beginning. And if they come back, we'll be ready." In the days that followed, word of the victory spread. Across the galaxy, whispers grew into murmurs, and murmurs into cries of defiance. Other oppressed species, long beaten into submission by the Empire, took heart from humanity's triumph. If a ragtag group of rebels could stand against the might of the Empire, perhaps they could too. The Empire's propagandists worked overtime, dismissing the loss as insignificant. Official broadcasts labeled the rebels as isolated terrorists and praised the fleet's tactical withdrawal. But beneath the veneer of control, cracks began to show. High-ranking officials demanded answers, questioning the Empire's invincibility. On the rebel moon, life moved on. The survivors rebuilt what they could, scavenging parts from the wreckage to reinforce their defenses. The howitzer, now a symbol of hope, was lovingly repaired and given a place of honor in the outpost. One evening, Ada stood beside it, her fingers tracing the worn metal. The stars above seemed closer now, their light sharper, more vibrant. Marcus approached, a rare moment of quiet between them. So, he said, what now? Ada didn't look away from the sky. Now we fight smarter. We use everything we've got, no matter how old, no matter how small. Let them laugh at our relics. Next time, they'll do it from the ground. Lee's voice called out from the distance, his tone lighter than it had been in days. Captain. You're gonna want to see this. Ada turned, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Looks like next time might come sooner than we thought. And as she followed Marcus and Lee into the outpost, her steps were lighter, her resolve unshaken. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, hope burned bright.